Glen had been standing at the edge of the stone ridge for 3 hours when the sky turned wrong. It did not darken the way storms did. It did not roll in slowly with clouds and wind. It simply changed, the way a candle looks just before it goes out. The air above the valley floor went thin and sharp, and every soldier around Glen felt it in their chest before they saw anything with their eyes. Glen pressed his back against the ridge wall and looked out across the open ground below. The valley sat between two territories, human land on one side, dragon land on the other. For 6 months, both sides had kept a careful quiet. No fighting. No crossing. Just watching. Glen and his unit were there to make sure that quiet held. But something had gone wrong tonight. He heard it before he saw it. A small sound, not a battle sound, not a weapon sound. Something softer. Something young. Glen leaned forward and looked down into the open ground between the ridges, and there, standing alone in the middle of the empty valley floor, was a dragon hatchling. It was tiny. Small enough that Glen could have carried it in both arms. Its scales were pale gray, still soft the way young scales are, and it was turning in slow circles the way a lost child turns when it does not know which direction leads home. It made that small sound again. A low, frightened cry that did not carry far but somehow reached Glen's ears anyway. Glen looked left. He looked right. The soldiers around him had all gone still. Not the still of men preparing to act. The still of men deciding not to. Then the sky cracked. 5 points of deep red light appeared above the far ridge. Glen had never seen mage-strikes that large. Most battlefield mages threw 1 at a time, 2 at most. 5 together meant something organized. Something planned. The enemy war mages on the far side had been waiting in position, hidden, patient, and now they had a target standing alone in the open with nowhere to run. The hatchling looked up. It saw the lights. It made that small frightened sound one more time. Glen was already moving before he finished thinking. He did not plan it. He did not weigh it or consider it or talk himself into it. His body moved the way bodies move when something deep and old takes over, the part of a person that does not wait for permission. He came off the ridge at a run, hit the valley floor hard, and crossed the open ground in long strides with his arms already coming up. He heard the soldiers behind him shout. He did not stop. He reached the hatchling in seconds, dropped to his knees, and pulled it against his chest with both arms wrapped around it. He pressed his body over it, making himself as large and wide as he could, his back turned up toward the sky. The first strike hit him between the shoulders. The pain was not like anything Glen had felt before. It was not sharp the way a blade is sharp. It was total, like every part of him was on fire and frozen at the same time. His teeth locked. His eyes went white for a moment. But his arms held. The second strike hit the back of his left arm. He felt something tear. He did not let go. The third came down across his spine and Glen's whole body shook from the force of it. The ground beneath him cracked. Dust and small stones jumped up around his knees. The hatchling under him made a sound, not frightened now, something different. Something confused. It pressed its small face against Glen's chest and went very still, as if it understood, in whatever way young creatures understand things, that the man above it was holding on for both of them. The fourth strike took Glen across the back of his neck and his vision went sideways. He felt his arms start to loosen. He tightened them again by force of will alone. His breathing had gone ragged and uneven. His body was sending him every signal it had: stop, fall, let go, lie down. Glen did not listen to any of them. He was still thinking about the hatchling. About how small it was. About how it had been standing alone in the open, turning in circles, looking for something safe. The fifth strike came down directly between his shoulders again, in almost the same place as the first. Glen did not remember falling. He was aware of the ground against his face, and of the hatchling still pressed under him, warm and alive and breathing fast. He was aware of the silence that followed, a deep, sudden silence the way a battlefield goes quiet after something happens that no one expected. He could hear the hatchling making a soft sound against his chest. He could feel its small claws gripping the front of his jacket, holding on to him the same way he had held on to it. He could not move his arms anymore. He could hear voices now, distant, getting closer. His own soldiers coming down from the ridge. Some of the Dragon Clan scouts appearing from the far tree line, drawn out by the sounds. He heard someone say his name. He heard someone else say something about the 5 strikes, about how that was not possible, about how no one survived 5 at once. Glen did not feel like a man who had survived anything. He felt like a man who had simply not let go yet. The hatchling pulled itself up slightly and looked at his face. Its eyes were pale gold, very wide, very clear. It looked at him the way young things look when they are trying to understand something that is too large for them. Then it pressed its small head against the side of his face and made a sound so quiet and so soft that only Glen was close enough to hear it. He closed his eyes. The medics arrived. The soldiers arrived. The dragon scouts arrived and stood at a distance, watching. Everyone who had been on that ridge, everyone who had stepped back, stood now at the edge of the valley floor and looked at the man lying in the cracked earth with a dragon hatchling curled against his chest, refusing to be moved by anyone. No one spoke for a long time. Then one of the older soldiers took off his helmet and held it against his chest. One by one, the others did the same. Not because anyone told them to. Not because it was required. But because some moments ask something of the people who witness them, and the only honest answer is silence and a small act of respect for a man who stepped forward when every instinct said step back. Glen did not see any of it. He was already somewhere else, drifting, breathing slowly, with 5 strikes burned into his back and a hatchling's heartbeat pressed against his own. Glen did not know he was unconscious. That was the strange part. There was no moment where everything went dark and he understood that he had crossed some line. One moment he was on the valley floor, feeling the hatchling's heartbeat against his chest. The next moment he was somewhere else entirely, and the somewhere else felt more quiet than anything he had ever known. There was no pain there. That was the first thing he noticed. The 5 burns across his back, the torn muscle in his arm, the pressure along his spine that had made breathing feel like lifting stone, all of it was gone. He was standing, though he could not remember standing up. The ground beneath his feet, if it was ground, had no color he could name. It was not dark and it was not light. It simply was. And ahead of him was the mist. It was gold. Not bright gold, not the gold of fire or sunlight. Something older than that. The kind of gold that sits at the edge of evening when the sun has already gone but the sky has not yet decided to go dark. It moved slowly, the way deep water moves, with weight and patience and no hurry at all. Glen stood at the edge of it and did not walk in. He was not sure he could have walked away either. Back on the valley floor, the hatchling was not calm. The medics had come down from the ridge fast, carrying their kits and their lights, and the first one to reach Glen had stopped short when the hatchling swung its small head around and made a sound that was not soft anymore. It was sharp and high and it came with a display of those pale gray wings spreading as wide as they would go, which was not very wide, because the hatchling was still young and small, but the intention behind it was very clear. Do not touch him. The medic, a steady woman named Ruth who had worked battlefield medicine for 11 years, had seen a great many things try to stop her from doing her job. She had not previously been stopped by something that came up to her knee. She crouched down slowly and kept her hands open and low, and she spoke in the flat calm voice she used when she needed something frightened to understand that she was not a threat. The hatchling watched her. Its gold eyes did not blink. Ruth did not move any closer. She simply stayed where she was, hands open, voice low, waiting. After a long moment the hatchling made a different sound, still unhappy, still warning, but smaller. Ruth moved forward by 1 careful inch. The hatchling did not spread its wings again. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of Ruth on her knees in cracked earth, not rushing, not pushing, earning each inch the slow way. When she finally got close enough to put her hands on Glen, the hatchling did not move away. It pressed itself tighter against Glen's side, one small claw hooked into the fabric of his jacket, and watched Ruth work with those unblinking gold eyes. It cried the entire time. Not loud crying. Not the sharp warning sound it had made before. Something quieter and worse, a thin, steady sound that had no anger in it, only fear. The kind of sound that says, "Please hurry. Please fix this. Please do not let this be the end." Ruth worked faster than she had ever worked. In the mist, Glen was not alone. He had not seen them arrive. He did not know when they had appeared. But when he looked out into the slow gold movement ahead of him, he became aware, gradually, the way your eyes adjust to low light, that there were shapes in it. Large shapes. Not human shapes. Not dragon shapes, exactly, though there was something about the way they held themselves, the weight and the stillness of them. That reminded him of the dragon elders he had seen once, standing at the edge of their territory in the early days of the peacekeeping post. Those elders had made the air feel different just by being in it. These shapes did the same thing, but more so. There were 4 of them. Standing at different distances in the mist, all of them turned toward Glen. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching him with a quality of attention that made him feel like he was being read. Not his words or his thoughts, but something underneath all of that. The part of a person that exists before they learn to explain themselves. Glen looked back at them and did not feel afraid. That surprised him. He thought he should feel afraid. The shapes were vast and the mist was strange and he had no idea where he was or how to leave. But there was nothing threatening in the way they watched him. It was more like recognition. The way someone looks at a person they have been expecting for a long time. One of the shapes shifted slightly. Just a small movement, like a breath. Glen had the strong feeling that it was trying to tell him something. Not in words, there were no words in this place. But in the feeling of the space between them. He stood very still and tried to receive whatever it was. The feeling that came back to him was simple. Not yet. Above the valley, the news was moving. It traveled the way impossible news always travels, first in whispers, then louder, hitting each person with a small shock that made them stop walking or put down what they were holding. 5 mage-strikes. 1 man. Still breathing. The human commanders heard it and went quiet in a way that meant they did not know what to say. In 11 years of border postings, in 20 years of records before that, there was no account of anyone surviving a single direct mage strike at full force. 3 had been known to kill at a distance. 5 direct, simultaneous, at close range. No one had written instructions for that because no one had imagined instructions would be needed. On the dragon side of the valley, the news reached the clan scouts first and moved inward from there. The elder who received the full account listened without interrupting and then was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said only that the old records mentioned a mark. A mark that certain strikes left on certain people under certain conditions. She had always believed it was a story. She asked to be taken to the valley. Meanwhile, Ruth had Glen stable, breathing on his own, pulse uneven but present, the worst of the surface burns dressed and covered. The hatchling had not moved from his side through any of it. It had stopped crying. It sat pressed against Glen's arm with its small head resting on his shoulder, watching his face with steady gold eyes, and it waited with a patience that seemed too large for something so young. As if it already knew he was coming back. As if it had been to the edge of that quiet place too, in whatever way young dragons dream, and it had seen the mist and the shapes and the man standing at the threshold, and it had decided, in whatever way young creatures decide the things that matter most, that it was going to stay right there until he returned. The night settled over the valley. Glen breathed slowly in the lamplight, and somewhere in the gold mist between one world and the next, four vast shapes stood and watched and waited alongside him. Glen woke up to warmth. Not the warmth of sunlight or fire. Something steadier than that. Something alive. He became aware of it slowly, the way a person becomes aware of morning, not all at once, but in small pieces. First the warmth. Then the weight on his chest, small and solid and breathing in a slow, even rhythm. Then the sound of the room around him, which was a deep and ancient quiet, the kind that belongs to places that have been standing for a very long time. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was stone. Dark stone, the color of deep water, carved from edge to edge with shapes he could not immediately understand. He lay still and looked up at them. Dragons, that much he could tell. Dragons in flight, dragons at rest, dragons standing over smaller figures with their wings spread wide. And between the dragons, words in a script he did not recognize, cut deep into the stone in long careful lines that curved and crossed and came back to each other like something that had no beginning and no end. Glen moved his eyes down from the ceiling. The walls were the same. Every surface carved, every inch of stone marked with something that felt important in a way he could not explain. There were no windows. The light in the room came from long channels cut into the base of the walls, filled with something that glowed amber and steady without flame or smoke. He looked down at his chest. Sora was there. The hatchling was curled into a tight circle just below Glen's collarbone, its pale gray wings folded flat, its small sides rising and falling in the slow rhythm he had felt before he opened his eyes. One tiny claw was hooked, very lightly, into the fabric over his heart. As if even in sleep it had kept hold of him. Glen lifted one hand slowly and rested it against the hatchling's back. Sora's eyes opened. Pale gold, wide, immediately alert. The hatchling looked up at him for one long moment and then made a sound so quiet Glen felt it more than heard it, a low, soft rumble that moved through its whole small body and into his hand and up his arm. Not fear. Not warning. Something that had no good word in any human language, but that Glen understood anyway. You are back. He tried to sit up. The pain reminded him, firmly, that 5 mage-strikes were not a thing a body forgot overnight. He made it to his elbows before he stopped and breathed carefully through the tightness across his back and shoulders. Sora sat up with him, watching his face, adjusting its position without being asked the way creatures do when they have been paying close attention to someone for a long time. It was then that Glen noticed he was not alone in the room. They were standing at the 4 corners of the chamber. One at each wall, evenly spaced, utterly still. Glen had not seen them when he first looked around, or perhaps he had not been ready to see them. His eyes had needed a moment to understand what they were looking at. 4 people. Or figures that wore the shape of people, though something about each of them made that word feel slightly too small. They were not in armor, exactly, though what they wore had the quality of armor. Layered, deliberate, built to last. Each of them carried a mark on their skin, visible at the neck or the hands, that looked burned rather than drawn. And each of them had, somewhere close, at their shoulder, at their feet, curled against their side, a dragon. Not hatchlings. Grown dragons, large and quiet, their eyes all open and all watching Glen with the same steady gold attention that Sora had. No one spoke. Glen looked at the 4 figures and felt, with strange certainty, that he had seen them before. Not in life. Not in any place he could name. In the mist. The 4 shapes standing in the slow gold movement, watching him with recognition. The figure at the far wall stepped forward. A man, broad across the shoulders, with gray at his temples and a burn mark along his jaw that had the same pattern Glen had felt across his own back without yet seeing it. His dragon, dark green, massive, silent. Moved with him the way a shadow moves, without being told. He stopped at the foot of Glen's stone bed and looked down at him. When he spoke, his voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had not needed to rush anything in a very long time. He said his name was Harold. He said the woman to Glen's left was May. The tall figure near the door was called Frank, and the one who had not moved from the far corner, the youngest looking of the four despite something ancient in her eyes, was called Ada. He said they were the Eternal Guardians. Glen knew the name. Everyone knew the name, the way everyone knows the names of things that are old enough to have passed from history into story. The Eternal Guardians had been warriors, human warriors, bonded to dragons, who had held the boundary between the mortal world and something older and larger for generations. And then, 300 years ago, they had walked into the deep territory and not come back. The stories said they had died. The stories said they had ascended. The stories disagreed on the details but agreed on one thing: they were gone. They were not gone. Harold looked at Glen without impatience, letting him take his time with it. Glen said the first thing that came to him, which was that he did not understand why he was here. Harold said that was a reasonable place to start. He sat down on the edge of the stone bed, unhurried, and he told Glen about the oath. Not a human oath, older than that. Something that had existed before humans had language for it, written into the fabric of the bond between dragons and the world. The oath said that one day a being would stand in the open and take 5 strikes for a dragon child without calculation, without hesitation, without any thought of what it would cost. Not because they were trained to. Not because they were ordered to. But because they could not do otherwise. That being, the oath said, would be the next guardian. Glen sat with that for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that he was a soldier. A border post soldier. He fixed equipment and followed orders and had never done anything that belonged in a story. May spoke then, from his left. Her voice was dry and direct and had a small edge of something that might have been amusement. She said that was exactly the point. Ada moved for the first time, stepping forward from her corner. Her dragon came with her, pale white, enormous, its eyes the same gold as Sora's. She looked at Glen with those ancient young eyes and said nothing at all. She simply reached out and touched the back of Glen's right hand, lightly, and turned it so the inside of his wrist faced up. There was a mark there. Burns from the 5 strikes, yes, but arranged. Patterned. 5 points connected by lines so clean they could not have been accidental, forming a shape Glen had seen cut into the stone walls around him in a dozen different places. The shield brand. Glen looked at his wrist. He looked up at the 4 figures standing in the amber light of the ancient chamber. He looked down at Sora, who was watching his face with those wide gold eyes and that expression of absolute patience. He had no more words for a while. Frank, who had not spoken yet, spoke now. His voice was low and matter-of-fact, and what he said was simple. He said, "Welcome home." Glen stared at his wrist for a long time. The mark was not painful. That was the strange part. 5 mage-strikes had torn through his back and shoulders and spine like something trying to unmake him, and yet the pattern they had left on the inside of his wrist felt no different from the rest of his skin. No heat. No tenderness. Just the mark, sitting there quietly, as if it had always been there and had simply been waiting for him to look. He pulled his hand back slowly and looked up at Harold. He said it again, more firmly this time. He said he was a soldier. A border post soldier who fixed supply lines and stood watches and had never once in his life done anything that 4 legendary warriors and a room full of ancient stone carvings should concern themselves with. He said there had to be a mistake. He said the mark was probably just the way the strikes had landed, just a pattern made by accident, the kind of shape a person sees in clouds if they look long enough. Harold let him finish. Then Harold turned to the wall to his left and pointed to a carving near the base of the stone, low down, close to the amber light channels. Glen leaned forward despite the pain in his back and looked at it. It was the mark. Exactly the mark. 5 points, the same lines, the same angles. Cut into the stone of this chamber so long ago that the edges had softened with age, worn smooth by centuries of air moving over them. Glen looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his wrist. Then back at the wall. Harold said that carving had been there for 900 years. Glen sat back and said nothing. May walked across the chamber and stood beside the carving. She pulled back the sleeve of her left arm and held it next to the stone. Her mark was different in its details, different points, different lines, but it had the same quality. The same sense of intention. She said each shield brand was unique to the person who carried it. She said no two were the same. She said the stone showed the one that was coming, not the ones that had already arrived. Glen looked at the carving again. He looked at his wrist again. The match was exact. He let out a long breath and dropped his head back against the stone behind him. Sora, who had been watching the whole exchange from Glen's lap with careful gold eyes, took this moment to climb up his chest and press its small head under his chin. Glen's hand came up automatically and rested on the hatchling's back. He said, to no one in particular, that this was a great deal to take in before breakfast. Frank made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Ada was watching Sora. Her pale white dragon had lowered its enormous head and was regarding the hatchling with an expression of what appeared to be gentle approval. Sora looked back at it with wide eyes and then looked up at Glen as if checking that this was acceptable. Glen had no guidance to offer. He simply kept his hand where it was. Ada said that the bond had already formed. She said it had formed on the valley floor, in the moment Glen covered Sora with his body. She said dragon bonds did not ask permission and did not wait for ceremony. They happened when they happened, and once they happened they did not unhappen. She said the elder dragons of Sora's clan had tried, carefully and respectfully, to approach the hatchling 3 times since it was brought here. 3 times Sora had turned away and come back to Glen. Glen looked down at Sora. Sora looked up at him with those steady gold eyes and that expression that had no good name in any human language. Glen said, quietly, that Sora had been doing that since the valley floor. Ada nodded. She said she knew. It was then that the door of the chamber opened. Glen had not noticed the door before. It was cut from the same dark stone as the walls and sat flush with the carving so that it disappeared into the pattern. It opened inward and slowly, and through it came 4 dragons that made the chamber feel immediately smaller. Not because of aggression. Simply because of size and age and the particular weight that very old things carry in a room. The elder dragons of Sora's clan. They were different colors, deep red, dark blue, the brown of old earth, and one so dark it was nearly black. Their scales did not have the soft look of Sora's. They were hard and layered and had clearly been through a great deal of weather and time. Their eyes were gold, all 4 of them, but a deeper gold than Sora's, the gold of something that had been burning for a long time. They filed into the chamber in silence. They looked at Glen. Glen looked back at them and tried to appear as though he received elder dragons in stone chambers on a regular basis and found it entirely manageable. The darkest one, the one that was nearly black, stepped forward from the 4. It was the largest. Its head, when it lowered it, came level with Glen's chest. It regarded him from that distance with eyes that had seen 3 centuries of things Glen could not imagine. Then, slowly, with a deliberateness that made the air in the room feel heavier, it lowered its head further. All the way down. Until its chin nearly touched the stone floor. A bow. The other 3 did the same, one after another, unhurried, each bow as deliberate as the first. Glen did not move. He was not sure he was breathing. Harold stepped to his side and said, quietly, that this had not happened in 300 years. He said the elder dragons did not bow to guardians out of ceremony or tradition. He said they bowed when they recognized something specific, a quality, an action, a choice. He said the word the dragons used for it did not translate cleanly into any human language, but the closest meaning was something like, one who gives without counting. Glen thought about that. He thought about the valley floor. About the 5 lights in the sky and the small gray hatchling turning in circles below them. He had not thought about cost in that moment. He had not thought about survival or odds or what would happen after. He had not been brave in the way that brave soldiers are brave, calculating, prepared, gritting their teeth against fear and pushing through it. He had simply moved. Because the hatchling was there and the strikes were coming, and there was no version of that moment in which he did not cover it with his body. He had not known, until Harold said the words, that there was a name for that. May said, gently, that bravery was something a person chose. What Glen had done was something older and simpler than choice. She said not many beings had it. She said the oath had been written 900 years ago because whoever wrote it understood that one day, one would come. Glen looked at the elder dragons, still holding their bow. He looked at Sora on his chest, watching his face. He looked at the mark on his wrist, sitting quietly where it had always been. He did not fully believe it yet. He was not sure belief was something that came all at once in moments like this. But something in him had shifted in a way that did not shift back. Something that understood, even if the rest of him was still catching up, that what happened on the valley floor had not been an accident or a reflex or a moment of poor judgment. It had been exactly what it was supposed to be. He reached out, slowly, and placed his marked hand on the floor between himself and the dark elder dragon. The elder dragon lifted its head and touched its nose, very lightly, to the back of Glen's hand. The chamber was completely silent. And somewhere in the amber light and the ancient carvings and the long quiet of a place that had been waiting 300 years for this moment, something that had been holding its breath finally let go. The bonding ceremony did not look like Glen had expected. He was not sure what he had expected. Something grand, perhaps. Something with fire and noise and the kind of weight that important moments are supposed to carry on the outside so that everyone present understands they are witnessing something significant. He had seen ceremonies before. Military ones, formal ones, the kind where everyone stands straight and the words are rehearsed and the meaning is supposed to come from the structure of it all. This was not like that. It was morning. Or what passed for morning in the deep mountain, a slow brightening of the amber light in the wall channels, a shift in the air that moved through the stone corridors like a breath. Harold led Glen out of the inner chamber and through a long passage that opened, eventually, onto a wide flat shelf of rock on the face of the mountain. The sky above it was the pale gray of very early day. The valley far below was still in shadow. The wind was cold and clean and smelled of high places. The four guardians stood in a loose half-circle. Their dragons stood behind them, large and still and quiet. The four elder dragons of Sora's clan were there too, arranged to one side, their ancient gold eyes catching the first pale light. Sora was in Glen's arms. The hatchling had climbed there when Glen stood up that morning and had shown no interest in being anywhere else. Glen had stopped trying to suggest otherwise. He had learned, in the short time he had known Sora, that the hatchling had opinions and held them firmly, and that arguing with those opinions was a way of spending energy that produced no results. Ada stepped forward from the half-circle. She was carrying nothing. She had no instrument, no scroll, no ceremonial object of any kind. She simply stood in front of Glen and looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at Sora. She asked Sora, in a quiet and direct voice, if it chose this bond freely. Sora looked at her. Then looked up at Glen. Then looked back at Ada and made a sound that was short and firm and left very little room for interpretation. Ada's mouth moved in something close to a smile. She asked Glen the same question. Glen looked down at the hatchling in his arms. At the pale gray scales and the wide gold eyes and the small claw hooked, as it always was, into the fabric over his heart. He thought about the valley floor. He thought about 5 strikes and cracked earth and a small frightened cry that had reached him across open ground. He thought about waking in the amber light with warmth on his chest and knowing, before he opened his eyes, that something had stayed. He said yes. He said it without hesitation and without ceremony, the same way he had run across the valley floor, because there was no version of the question in which the answer was anything else. Ada nodded once. She reached out and touched 2 fingers to the mark on Glen's wrist and 2 fingers to the small scales at the back of Sora's neck. She held them there for a moment. The amber light in the wall channels behind them brightened slightly, though there was no reason it should have. Then she stepped back. That was all. Frank said, from his place in the half-circle, that it was done. Glen waited for something more. Nothing more came. He looked around at the guardians and the dragons and the pale early sky, and he understood that this was one of those things that did not need more. It was done because it was done, because it had actually been done on a valley floor weeks ago, and everything since had simply been the world catching up to what had already happened between a man and a hatchling in cracked earth under a broken sky. Sora pressed its head under Glen's chin and rumbled. Later that morning, Glen sat alone at the edge of the rock shelf with his legs hanging over and Sora beside him. The valley below was coming into light now, the shadow pulling back slowly the way shadows do when they have no reason to hurry. He could see the ridge where his unit had been stationed. He could see, just barely, the dark patch in the valley floor where the earth had cracked under 5 strikes. He had asked Harold, the evening before, if he could send a message to his unit. Harold had said that guardians did not disappear from the world. He said that was one of the things people had wrong about the old stories. He said guardians stood between the world and what was beyond it, which meant they had to remain connected to the world, not removed from it. He said Glen could send whatever message he needed to send. Glen had thought about it for a long time. He had written and set aside several versions. In the end he had kept it short, because the long versions all tried to explain something that did not fully fit into explanation. The message said, "I am still a soldier. I still guard. I just guard something bigger now. Take care of each other. Do not step back." He had signed it with his name and nothing else. He did not know if they would understand it. He thought Ruth might. He thought the older soldiers, the ones who had taken off their helmets in the valley that night, might understand something of it even if they could not have said exactly what. He thought the younger ones would read it and find it strange, and that was fine. Some things were allowed to be strange until they were not anymore. Sora shifted beside him on the rock shelf, folding and refolding its wings the way young dragons do when they are restless and interested in everything. It was looking down at the valley with those wide gold eyes, watching the light move across it with the focused attention of a creature that found the world deeply worth watching. Glen watched it for a moment. Then he looked out at the valley too. Harold came and stood behind them after a while. He did not speak immediately. He stood with his green dragon beside him and looked out at the same view, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind between people who do not need to fill it. After a time Harold said that the world below was changing. He said the old boundaries between human land and dragon land were shifting, had been shifting for years, and that what was coming would need something the old arrangements did not have. He said it would need people who stood in the middle. Not on one side or the other, but between, the way guardians had always stood. Glen said he understood. Harold said he knew. He said that was why Glen was here. He went back inside after that, leaving Glen and Sora on the edge of the mountain in the growing morning light. Sora looked up at Glen. Glen looked down at Sora. The hatchling made its quiet rumbling sound, the one that had no good word in any human language. Glen had decided, by now, that he did not need a word for it. He knew what it meant. It meant the same thing it had meant on the valley floor and in the amber chamber and every moment in between. You are not alone. I am here. I am staying. Glen put his hand on Sora's back. Below them the world went about its morning, unknowing and busy and full of the 10,000 ordinary things that make up a life. And above it, on the face of an ancient mountain that most maps did not bother to name, a man who had once been a border post soldier sat with a dragon hatchling beside him and watched over all of it. Not because fate had written his name in stone 900 years ago. Because on one ordinary evening, in one small moment that no one else had been watching for, he had looked at something small and frightened and alone, and he had moved toward it instead of away. That was all it had ever taken. That was all it would ever take.